Hey guys, APAT5 here, and welcome to 3 Game Boy games that really shouldn't be on the Game Boy. I believe I'm going to title it something about consoles and stuff. These are 3 games that I've found in my Game Boy collecting that I really think sort of pushed the Game Boy to its limits and probably should have stayed on their original consoles. These are just sort of a thing to marvel at. None of them are really that good of a game, but here we go. The first game I wanted to talk about is Driver 2. Now, first here I'm showing you Driver 2 on the PlayStation 1, which I did a Let's Play on a couple weeks ago. Now, this had a big open world that was pretty impressive for the time, and I sort of talked about that a lot in my playthrough. You can actually get out of the car, which I never could figure out how to do. It had an animated intro that was in FMV, and I couldn't record it because of resolution problems. But anyways, yes, it was a pretty cool game, and it had this thing called survival mode, which is just really entertaining because all the cop cars literally just suicide bomb you. So, they ported it to the Game Boy. The Game Boy Advance specifically. The intro isn't animated. They had to take away a lot of it. The thing about the Game Boy Advance is that it is 32-bit, but obviously not as powerful as something, say, the PS1. So they did try to port some PS1 games onto the Game Boy Advance, and there were some weird consequences for that. However, the reason I'm mentioning Driver 2 first is it's actually fairly playable, and it even tells you how to exit the vehicle, which I wish I paid attention to that more when I first played it, because then I would have finally figured out how to exit the vehicle on the PS1, which is a whole nother story that I cover in that Let's Play. Again, since they were cutting around some corners, there is even survival mode in this game, but sadly it's a lot easier. Next is Race Driving for the Sega Genesis. Apparently one of the earliest 3D games, or at least something that was technologically advanced for the Genesis years. I actually prefer Hard Driving, which is basically the sequel to Race Driving, because it controls better and the graphics are a bit better. It's just more furtherly polished, but it's a pretty cool game, and you get like these little replays when you crash. It's still really difficult to control though, which is why I prefer Hard Driving. Now you might think, well, this was before the Game Boy Advanced, and you would be right. They ported Race Driving, a 3D racing game that was even a big deal for the Sega Genesis, onto the 8-bit original Game Boy. They actually try to imitate the music, so I'll do a comparison of that right now. However, since it's on the Game Boy, there are a lot of problems with it. It slows down even more than on the Genesis. It's really hard to control and pretty easy to crash. That sort of plagues both versions though, but it is even more difficult on the Game Boy. It is just a really cool thing to look at, however, because they managed to render so much into this. It's a Game Boy game. It's a 3D Game Boy game, and that's pretty impressive. Even though it's really doesn't belong on the system. As you drive around, you'll see a few barns that have been modeled off to the side, and you'll see the cars, which are just white rectangles, but still pretty cool because you see a white rectangle in 3D. The most impressive thing for me was probably the loop-de-loop that you come up on, but then driving around it isn't really that impressive. Although you can crash in spectacular fashions in this version, you cannot see the replay of your car crashing, which I can imagine why they got rid of it, but it still would have been cool to have that there. Now here is the #1 game that I think should have just been left on its native console, because this is just, I can't even comprehend why they attempted to do this. Medal of Honor Underground. Now here I'll show you the menus of Medal of Honor Underground, just so you get a hint of this. This is on the PlayStation 1. You have to fiddle around with the controls for a while to get the control setting you prefer when you enter the game, but it's an alright first-person shooter, and it's on the PlayStation 1. The first mission, you're going through the level in search of your brother, and then you have to like fight your way out of it. But it starts with like a little introduction to your mission with a voiceover.
New mission. Remember that Danish boy who lives below me? You know, Niels. The one.
And I just want you to get a look at the graphics of this game, okay? Just, you know, let it all sink in. This 3D first-person shooter from like 2000. One thing I liked about this game, be it weird or not, is that with every shot you put into a person, they react differently depending on where you hit them. That might seem slightly disturbing, but it's just an extra touch that they put into the game instead of just bam bam and then they fall over. It's a very solid game, and I would recommend it to probably anyone who collects PS1 games. It's just pretty fun to play through, and I've gotten fairly far into it. I am back in my Medal of Honor days. Now, some genius, I'm guessing at EA, but we'll never know, decided let's port this to the Game Boy Advance. Now, I've been wanting to do a video on this forever because I thought this was the most ridiculous thing ever. There's two games that are sort of sequels to each other called Elks vs. Silver or something like that, which is actually a very playable and fun first-person shooter on the Game Boy Advance. So this can be done properly. However, look at this. For one, this is the menu of Medal of Honor Underground. They did try to animate it a little bit, just like the one on the PlayStation 1. And when you go to the actual mission, it just has a bunch of text and not voiceover. But that's all kind of expected. But then you finally get to the game, and they literally tried to map everything exactly the same. As you can see here, I walk up to that same area where that first enemy was at, and there is a little blue speck sort of walking around that I have to go and shoot. Just everything here, they tried to copy it perfectly, but in Game Boy graphics, and it just doesn't work. However, you do still get Molotovs, which is pretty cool, and just the fact they tried to do this blows my mind. In the PlayStation 1 version, you can see the Eiffel Tower when you're, or the bottom of the Eiffel Tower, when you're walking through the garden area. However, on the Game Boy Advance, I can't even tell if they even attempted to render the Eiffel Tower. And then you get to your brother. This is your brother. And just this whole game just seems very ridiculous to me. I mean, it's very interesting, and I did spend probably more time than I should have on this simply because I was playing Medal of Honor on a Game Boy. But why? So that was 3 console games that probably shouldn't have been ported onto the Game Boy. I hope you liked this weird video, and let me know if there's any other weird stuff that you might want to see. I do have quite a collection of Game Boy stuff, so there's that too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.